I am Clara. I am 29 years old, and exactly 34 days after I walked down the aisle entirely alone, my family's perfectly manufactured, highly curated lives burned straight to the ground. While I was sitting in my bridal suite, staring at 50 expensive mahogany chairs reserved for my own flesh and blood, my parents told me that driving 2 hours to my wedding was simply too exhausting for them. They abandoned me on the most important day of my life, choosing to prioritize a luxury cruise vacation over their only daughter. They laughed it off over the phone, my mother specifically telling me that a wedding is just a party and I was being incredibly selfish for demanding their presence. But there is one massive thing they did not know. The quiet, supposedly unimpressive man I was marrying was not the mid-level administrative worker they treated like absolute garbage. He was the billionaire CEO who held the absolute power to save or completely destroy my golden child brother's sinking tech company. And right now, my phone is violently detonating with 215 missed calls, frantic text messages, and sobbing voicemails from the very people who threw me away. They are begging for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their toxic empire without raising my voice a single time, please hit that like button if you believe that karma never misses an address. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us go back to where this nightmare truly began. I was sitting on the back porch of my home, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the ancient oak trees that lined our property. The air was perfectly still. The only sound in the entire world was the aggressive, relentless buzzing of my cell phone against the glass surface of the patio table. It had been peacefully, beautifully silent for over a month. Not a single word from my mother, Margaret. Not a text from my father, Richard. Nothing from my older brother, Julian. They had completely ghosted me after discarding my wedding invitation like a piece of junk mail. But now, the screen was lighting up like a slot machine paying out a jackpot. Call after call. Text after text. Voicemail after voicemail. I did not answer a single one. I simply leaned back in my wicker chair and watched the notifications roll in. I could read the frantic previews of the text messages popping up on the locked screen. Clara, please pick up the phone, you have to talk to him. Clara, Julian is going to lose his house. Victoria is threatening a divorce. Clara, how could you not tell us who Alexander really is? You set us up. Call your mother immediately. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The warmth spread through my chest, settling a lifetime of anxiety into a profound, absolute sense of peace. To understand why a daughter would sit in total silence while her family suffered a complete psychological meltdown, you have to understand the specific, suffocating hierarchy I was born into. In my family, love was not an unconditional given. It was a highly restricted currency, and every single dollar of it was deposited directly into Julian's emotional bank account. My parents treated Julian like he was the second coming of royalty. Growing up, the disparity between us was not just noticeable, it was aggressively flaunted. It was baked into the very foundation of our household. When Julian decided he wanted to switch private colleges because the dormitories at his first university were not up to his luxurious standards, my parents drained a massive portion of their savings to accommodate him. They even liquidated a piece of their real estate portfolio to ensure he had the best of the best. Meanwhile, when I was accepted into a highly respectable state university, I was sat down at the kitchen table and handed a brochure for student loans. I was told that building character meant working for my own college fund. I worked night shifts at a diner just to afford my textbooks, while Julian drove a brand new sports car that my father leased for him as a motivational tool. I was the glass child. The invisible one. The pragmatic, quiet sister who demanded nothing and received exactly that in return. My parents expected me to be entirely self-sufficient so they could pour all their energy, money, and attention into my brother's never-ending series of manufactured crises and grandiose dreams. This dynamic was never more painfully obvious than at my grandmother's funeral 5 years ago. I loved my grandmother deeply. She was the only person in the family who ever truly saw me. But instead of mourning, my mother treated the funeral like a networking event. She spent the entire wake introducing Julian to wealthy, distant relatives, aggressively pitching his supposedly brilliant tech startup ideas over plates of catered sandwiches. While I stood in the corner folding the memorial programs and comforting the grieving guests, my mother was handing out Julian's business cards. They turned a funeral into a venture capital pitch for the golden child. It was sickening. When I met Alexander 3 years ago, I thought I had finally found a safe harbor. Alexander was a quiet, steady man. He wore plain, unbranded sweaters, drove a standard sedan, and never bragged about his accomplishments. He listened when people spoke. He remembered the little things. I loved him with everything I had. But when I brought him home for our first Thanksgiving dinner, my family immediately categorized him as a failure. We were sitting around the massive dining room table, the turkey half-eaten, when my mother set her wine glass down and fixed her predatory gaze on Alexander. "So, Alexander," Margaret said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Clara tells us you work in an office in the city. What exactly do you do?" "I work in corporate administration and investments, ma'am," Alexander replied politely, keeping his tone even. My mother actually scoffed out loud. She looked at my father, sharing a knowing smirk. "Administration? So you're a secretary for the investment brokers? Tell me, what kind of salary does a position like that pull in these days? Is there even room for a promotion, or are you just stamping paperwork all day?" It was a deeply inappropriate question, delivered with the casual cruelty of a woman who measures human worth entirely by tax brackets and zip codes. Alexander politely declined to answer, simply stating that he was comfortable and happy with his work. From that moment on, they completely dismissed him. They assumed he was a mid-level drone, barely scraping by, entirely unworthy of their respect. They patronized him with the same condescending politeness they reserved for cashiers at the grocery store. Whenever Julian started boasting about his startup, my parents would shoot pitying looks at Alexander, as if his quiet life was a tragic disease. Neither Alexander nor I ever corrected their assumptions. We knew their lack of curiosity was a symptom of their own self-absorption. We did not want them digging into our lives. We just wanted to exist in peace. We wanted to build our own life, far away from their toxic judgments. But the absolute peak of their delusion, the moment that finally shattered the rose-colored glasses I had superglued to my own face for nearly 30 years, happened exactly 2 months ago. It was the event that set the entire stage for the ultimate betrayal. It was a blisteringly bright Saturday in early June. I found myself standing on the edge of a lavish, rented beachfront cabana in Malibu, California, shielding my eyes from the glaring Pacific sun. This monumental, over-the-top gathering was Julian's gender reveal party. He and his highly demanding wife, Victoria, were expecting twins. Victoria was the kind of woman who treated her pregnancy like a royal ascension, demanding constant attention and luxury at every turn. To say my parents went all out would be a criminal understatement. My entire extended family, my parents, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, and 6 cousins, had joyfully coordinated flights across 15 states, traveling all the way from the humid, sticky suburbs of New Jersey to the pristine coast of Southern California. My father, a man who routinely complained about his mild arthritis and chronic back pain just to get out of helping my mother carry the groceries from the driveway, had practically sprinted through Newark Airport to make his first-class connection. My mother had spent 3 solid weeks agonizing over the perfect designer pastel outfit to wear for the professional photographer that Julian had demanded they hire. They spared absolutely no expense for this unborn twin spectacle. My parents funded the first-class tickets for themselves, Julian, and Victoria. They secured luxury oceanfront hotel suites for the extended relatives, making sure everyone had a balcony view of the water. They hired a high-end, professional event planner named Olivia, who orchestrated a display of sheer, unadulterated excess. We are talking about a rented helicopter dropping biodegradable pink and blue confetti over the ocean, while a hired string quartet played pop covers directly on the sand. There was a massive open bar serving vintage champagne, towering ice sculptures, platters of imported seafood, and floral arrangements that cost more than my first car. I was there too. But I had quietly purchased my own economy ticket and booked a modest, single-room Airbnb a few miles inland, away from the expensive beachfront. I went because I still harbored that naive, exhausting illusion that showing up for my family, playing the supportive sister role, would eventually result in them showing up for me. I spent the entire afternoon standing near the catered buffet, observing them from a distance. I watched my parents fawn over Julian. Julian stood at the center of the cabana, a glass of champagne in his hand, a man whose manufactured charm barely concealed his towering arrogance. He ran a tech startup that he constantly bragged about, portraying himself as the next Silicon Valley visionary. But anyone with an ounce of business acumen could see the cracks in his facade. He talked in buzzwords, lacking any real substance. While I was grabbing a bottle of sparkling water, the event planner, Olivia, walked over to check the ice buckets. She looked exhausted, her clipboard pressed against her chest. She wiped her forehead, looked up at the helicopter circling the beach, and struck up a casual conversation with me. She had no idea I was Julian's sister. Crazy, isn't it? Olivia muttered, shaking her head. I have been planning events in Los Angeles for 12 years, and I have never seen grandparents go this hard for a gender reveal. The older couple from New Jersey actually wired me $75,000 for this afternoon alone. The mother told me they had to delay their own retirement plans and borrow against their 401k just to pull it off. People are absolutely out of their minds. I felt all the blood drain from my face. My stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. $75,000. My parents were willing to jeopardize their financial security, their retirement, and their future just to throw a party announcing the gender of children who had not even taken their first breath yet. Meanwhile, when I had excitedly showed my mother the modest, budget-friendly catering menu for my upcoming wedding a few months prior, she had rolled her eyes, complained about the cost of chicken versus beef, and told me I needed to stop expecting handouts from them. The hypocrisy was physically nauseating. Exactly 4 weeks and 2 days after that sun-drenched spectacle in Malibu, the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal occurred. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before my wedding. The venue Alexander and I had chosen was a beautiful, rustic estate in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. It was exactly a 2-hour and 15-minute drive from my parents' house in New Jersey. A straight shot down the interstate. Easy, familiar terrain with plenty of rest stops. I was sitting at my kitchen island, finalizing the seating chart and writing personalized thank you notes for the guests, when my phone rang. It was my mother, Margaret. I answered on the first ring, expecting her to ask about the rehearsal dinner schedule or what time the photographer was arriving. Instead, her voice dripped with that specific, practiced tone of superficial regret that narcissistic people use when they have already absolved themselves of any guilt. "Clara, sweetheart," she began, the fake sympathy grating instantly against my eardrums. "Your father's back is just acting up terribly. And honestly, after all that exhausting travel to California last month, we are just entirely drained. We simply cannot make the drive this weekend." I froze. The pen dropped from my hand, clattering against the granite countertop. I gripped the edge of the island so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I stared at the seating chart, where her name was written in elegant calligraphy at the head table. "You are not coming to my wedding?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, it is a 2-hour drive. You sit in a comfortable car for 2 hours. That is it. You don't have to fly. You don't have to walk. You just have to be there." She sighed heavily into the receiver, completely unbothered by the astronomical hypocrisy of her statement. "Please do not be difficult, Clara. Victoria's pregnancy is high risk, and we needed to be there in California to support Julian. That was a necessity. A wedding is just a party. We will send a nice gift in the mail, but you really should not be so selfish as to demand we put your father's health at risk for a tower car ride." "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice trembling with a rage I had suppressed for nearly 30 years. You flew 3,000 miles for a gender reveal, Mom. You spent $75,000 on a helicopter and champagne. And you cannot drive 2 hours to watch your only daughter get married. Do not raise your voice at me, Clara, she snapped, the sweet facade instantly vanishing, replaced by the cold, authoritarian tone she always used to silence me. This is exactly why your brother is the successful one. He understands family priorities. If you keep pushing this, we might just have to rethink your portion of the inheritance entirely. Do not ruin your own day by being dramatic. We are not coming. Goodbye. She hung up. The line went dead. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just stared at the blank wall of my kitchen, the dial tone ringing in my ears like a funeral bell for my family. By the end of that day, the dominoes fell exactly as I should have expected. My aunts, my uncles, and my cousins had all conveniently formulated their own miraculously synchronized excuses. A sudden summer cold. A scheduling conflict with a local golf tournament. Vague mentions of car trouble that magically affected 3 different households at the exact same time. It became glaringly obvious that a collective decision had been orchestrated by my mother. My wedding simply did not warrant their effort. They had all decided to boycott it. They were sending a message. But the universe has a highly ironic way of delivering the truth when you need it most. That evening, I received a text from my maid of honor, my supposed best friend of 10 years, Sarah. The message was a frantic, poorly written paragraph claiming a sudden, severe family emergency meant she could not attend the wedding. She apologized profusely and promised to make it up to me. I was devastated. I was losing my family and my best friend in the span of 12 hours. But an hour later, I logged into an alternate, anonymous social media account I used to follow cooking vlogs. I checked Sarah's page. She had accidentally left her temporary story on the public setting. The video showed Sarah sitting in the opulent first-class lounge at JFK Airport, holding a mimosa and laughing at the camera. The caption was a knife straight to my heart. It read, "Huge shout out to Mama Margaret for hiring me as a personal assistant for this luxury Caribbean cruise. Best week ever." My mother had literally bribed my best friend with an all-expenses-paid luxury vacation to abandon me at the altar. And my sick, bedridden, exhausted parents were currently boarding a massive, luxury ocean liner heading toward the Bahamas on the exact weekend they were supposed to be watching me walk down the aisle. They weren't tired. They weren't sick. They just hated me. The storm was fully raging in my mind, tearing up the foundations of everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. But on the outside, I was completely numb. The betrayal was so precise, so incredibly calculated and vicious, it felt like a surgical blade slipping directly between my ribs. They did not just want to skip my wedding, they wanted to actively humiliate me. They wanted to ensure I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was entirely worthless to them. They had spent my entire life grooming me to accept less, and this was their grand finale. The next morning, just 2 days before the wedding, my phone rang again. This time, it was my cousin, Fiona. Fiona was the family's designated peacekeeper. She was the one who always played the sweet, concerned middleman, the one who baked cookies for neighborhood events and always pretended to care about everyone's feelings. But I knew Fiona. I knew she was deeply ingrained in my mother's gossip circle. "Clara, oh my goodness, I am so incredibly sorry about Aunt Margaret and Uncle Richard," Fiona said, her voice dripping with artificial, syrupy honey. "I feel just awful that I cannot be there either. My kids came down with a stomach bug, you know how it is. We are practically living in the bathroom. How are you holding up, sweetie?" "I am managing, Fiona," I replied softly, keeping my tone entirely neutral. I knew she was fishing for a reaction. I refused to give her one. "That is good. You are so strong, you always have been. Hey, speaking of strong, how is Alexander taking this? Is his little office job giving him enough time off for the honeymoon? You know, Julian was actually asking about him the other day. Julian's company is doing some major restructuring, looking for new investors, and he wanted to know exactly what Alexander does at that firm he works for. Horizon, right? Does Alexander know anyone in upper management?" Anyone who could push a file through. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind. Fiona was not calling to comfort me. She was calling on behalf of Julian. I knew the rumors. Everyone in the family knew the rumors, even if my parents tried to suppress them. Julian's highly publicized tech startup was failing spectacularly. He had burned through millions of dollars in seed money, spending it on lavish corporate retreats, luxury company vehicles, and expensive PR campaigns instead of actual product development. He was currently facing a massive, career-ending lawsuit from his early investors for breach of fiduciary duty. He had hired an expensive lawyer, but could barely afford the retainer. He was desperately hunting for a Series B funding injection to avoid total bankruptcy and potential criminal fraud charges. Fiona was acting as a spy. She was trying to figure out if my boring, administrative worker fiancé could somehow be used as a stepping stone to secure a meeting at Horizon Ventures to save Julian's disastrous, fraudulent career. Even on the week of my wedding, while boycotting my ceremony, they were trying to extract value from me. Alexander works in basic administration, I lied smoothly, staring at the blank wall of my kitchen. He does not know any executives. He just files paperwork, Fiona. He cannot help Julian. Oh, Fiona said, her tone instantly dropping its warm, comforting facade. The honey evaporated, leaving nothing but cold, transactional disappointment. Right. Well, I will let Julian know. Have a nice little wedding, Clara. She hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. When Saturday morning finally arrived, the weather was absolutely perfect. The sun was shining, and the air in the Pocono Mountains was crisp and clean. I sat in the bridal suite of the elegant estate, staring at my reflection in the ornate vanity mirror. My hair was perfectly styled, my makeup was flawless, and the intricate lace of my wedding dress hugged my frame perfectly. Yet, my phone screen remained entirely devoid of notifications from the people who shared my last name. No apologies. No well wishes. No sudden changes of heart. Nothing but the deafening silence of absolute rejection. I stood up, smoothed the front of my gown, and walked out of the suite. The ceremony took place in the terraced gardens under a massive, breathtaking canopy of ancient willow trees. As I stood at the very back of the aisle, waiting for the music to start, the reality of my life was laid out before me in perfect, symmetrical clarity. The right side of the aisle was completely full. It was packed with Alexander's warm, welcoming family, our genuine friends, our former college roommates, and the mentors who had guided us through our careers. They were smiling, their eyes filled with genuine tears of joy. They were present. The left side of the aisle, the 50 expensive, beautifully decorated mahogany chairs specifically designated for my parents, my brother, my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins, was completely and utterly empty. A gaping, silent void in the middle of a beautiful celebration. It looked like a monument to my family's cruelty. The string quartet began to play. I did not shed a single tear. I did not break down. The grief had already been processed 1,000 times over during my childhood. I had mourned the loss of my parents' love when I was a teenager, crying alone in my bedroom while they cheered for Julian at his high school football games, completely ignoring my own academic awards. I had mourned them when they skipped my college graduation. What was left in its wake on my wedding day was a profound, crystalline clarity. I realized that attempting to extract unconditional love from people who view affection as a tool for manipulation is a fool's errand. You cannot negotiate with emotional terrorists. I took a deep breath, picked up my bouquet of white ranunculus, and walked down that aisle entirely alone. My chin was held high. My gaze was fixed straight ahead. Every step I took was a step away from the toxic shadow of my family. But as I reached the halfway point, I realized I was not truly alone. Waiting for me at the altar was Alexander. His dark eyes held a steadfast, unwavering warmth. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with absolute, undeniable respect. He knew everything about my family's betrayal. He knew about the cruise. He knew about Sarah, and he stood there like an unbreakable fortress. And standing beside him was Silas. Silas was a much older, incredibly distinguished gentleman who served as Alexander's primary business mentor and closest confidant. When I reached the front, the officiant cleared his throat and asked the traditional question, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" In the absence of my father, the silence lingered for a heavy second. But then, Silas stepped forward. He placed a warm, fatherly hand on my shoulder, looking directly at the empty chairs on my side, and then looked at me. "She gives herself," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute, booming authority across the gardens. "Because she is a woman of immense strength and unparalleled grace. But she is received by all of us here today with the highest honor and with the family she truly deserves." It was the most incredibly beautiful, intimate, and profoundly healing moment of my entire life. I married the man I loved, surrounded strictly by people who valued my character over my utility. The emotional chain that had dragged behind me, choking me for nearly 3 decades, finally snapped and turned to dust. I was entirely free. The reception that followed the ceremony was a masterpiece of culinary excellence and genuine, unforced joy. We drank vintage French champagne, we ate perfectly seared filet mignon, and we danced under an endless canopy of stars. We celebrated without a single moment of manufactured drama, without my mother complaining about the lighting, and without Julian trying to hijack the microphone to give a speech about his own accomplishments. It was pure, unadulterated happiness. I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. But as the night wore on and the wine continued to flow, several of my college friends began to marvel at the venue. The magnificent private estate where we were currently celebrating was a sweeping, 70-acre sanctuary. It featured a pristine private lake, immaculate manicured gardens, horse stables, and a massive stone mansion that looked like it belonged on the cover of an architectural magazine. It was a place of breathtaking, quiet luxury. When I had sent my mother the address months ago, she had dismissively assumed it was some budget-friendly public park I had rented for pennies. She had laughed at the zip code and told me I should have saved up for a proper country club. She was dead wrong. This entire estate did not belong to a rental company. It was Alexander's private, personal property. The quiet, unassuming man whom my family dismissed as a pathetic corporate drone was actually the founder and principal managing partner of Horizon Ventures. Horizon was one of the most aggressive, highly capitalized, and ruthlessly successful technology investment firms on the entire East Coast. Alexander possessed a personal net worth that made my parents' upper-middle-class suburban posturing look like absolute child's play. He wielded a level of absolute, decisive authority in the corporate sector that men like my brother Julian spent their entire miserable lives desperately trying to proximity themselves to. Alexander and I had intentionally kept the details of his incredible financial reality completely hidden from my family. It was not a game. It was a necessary, vital boundary of self-preservation. I knew precisely how my parents operated. If they had known the true extent of Alexander's wealth, their entirely absent interest in me would have violently transformed into an obsessive, suffocating campaign of manipulation. They would have demanded I leverage his money for their own social elevation. They would have paraded him at their country club dinners like a trophy. My mother would have demanded we buy her a new vacation home, and my father would have relentlessly pressured Alexander to fund Julian's endless, fraudulent business failures to avoid the impending lawsuit. If we ever had children, I knew my mother would try to assert custody over our lives, using our wealth to fuel her own narcissism. Keeping Alexander's true identity a secret was the only way to protect our peace, protect our relationship, and protect our assets from a family of emotional vampires. While we were cutting our 4-tier wedding cake, laughing with Silas and our genuine friends, a very different, desperate scene was unfolding a few hundred miles away. Julian's deeply troubled tech startup was officially entering a death spiral. He was burning through his remaining capital at an astonishing rate, facing massive unpaid vendor invoices, and looking down the barrel of a complete financial collapse that would strip him of his cars, his home, and his precious reputation. For the past 18 months, Julian had been aggressively trying to secure a pitch meeting with the elusive executive board at Horizon Ventures. He constantly complained to my parents about the impenetrable wall of corporate gatekeepers preventing him from accessing the firm's legendary CEO. Julian had absolutely no idea that the legendary, ruthless CEO he worshipped like a god was the exact same man he had refused to make eye contact with at our Thanksgiving dinner table for the past 3 years. He had no idea that the man whose salary he had mocked was the man who controlled his entire financial destiny. Just 2 days after my wedding, while Alexander and I were enjoying a quiet, peaceful honeymoon on the terrace of the estate, Alexander's phone buzzed. He picked it up, read a secure corporate email from his Manhattan office, closed the screen, and looked across the patio table at me. The morning sunlight caught the silver wedding band on his left hand. Julian finally got his meeting, Alexander said softly, his voice completely devoid of emotion. My senior partners reviewed his desperate application. They approved his request for a Series B funding pitch next month at the Manhattan headquarters. I stopped drinking my coffee. I set the porcelain mug down on the glass table. I felt a cold, incredibly sharp thrill run down my spine, electrifying every nerve in my body. The collision course between my family's suffocating arrogance and my husband's absolute professional authority was now firmly locked in. It was inescapable. It was ticking down like a metronome toward a spectacular, entirely unavoidable confrontation. My brother was walking directly into the lion's den, completely blind to who the lion actually was. I looked at the man who had stood by me when my own blood had abandoned me. I smiled, a genuine, powerful smile. "Do what you do best," I whispered. I thought the worst part of my life was finally over. I thought the pain was behind me. I was so incredibly wrong. Because what happened in that glass-walled Manhattan boardroom exactly 34 days later would not just expose the truth, it would completely, permanently rewrite the entire history of my family, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. Exactly 34 days had passed since the moment I walked down that sunlit garden aisle entirely alone. 34 days of absolute, uninterrupted, glorious peace. Following our wedding, Alexander and I had settled down into our life together with a quiet, profound joy that I had honestly never experienced in my entire 29 years on this earth. We spent our weekends walking the expansive, meticulously manicured grounds of his estate, cooking meals together in our massive chef's kitchen, and simply enjoying the silence. For the very first time in my entire life, I was not constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was not bracing myself for an angry phone call demanding money, or an entirely fabricated, dramatic family crisis designed specifically to pull all the attention back to my older brother. I was just Clara. I was a wife, a partner, and a woman who had finally. But out there in the real world, specifically in the high-stakes, incredibly cutthroat environment of Manhattan venture capital, the clock was rapidly ticking down to a spectacular, unavoidable collision. It was a crisp, beautifully clear Tuesday morning in mid-July. The kind of morning where the air feels charged with possibility. I woke up early, around 6 in the morning, and walked into our sprawling master bathroom. Alexander was already awake. He was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, dressed in a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray bespoke suit that probably cost more than my parents' first mortgage. He was quietly, methodically adjusting his silver cufflinks. His face was a mask of complete, unshakable professional calm. There was absolutely no malice in his dark eyes, no nervous, jittery energy, and no vindictive smirk. He looked exactly the way he always looked before a major, multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition, focused, terrifyingly sharp, and entirely detached from human emotion. I leaned against the marble doorframe, holding my cup of black coffee, just watching him for a moment. "Today is the day," I said softly, breaking the quiet of the morning. Alexander turned to me, his intense expression softening for just a fraction of a second. "Today is the day," he confirmed, his voice a low, steady rumble that always made me feel incredibly safe. Julian's Series B funding pitch is scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock sharp in the main executive boardroom. Marcus and the rest of the senior executive team are already at the headquarters, prepping the financial dossiers and running the final background checks on his corporate accounts. I walked over, set my coffee mug down on the granite counter, and reached out to smooth the lapels of his suit jacket. He really doesn't know, does he? He has absolutely no idea he is walking right into your building, right into your trap. He has no idea, Alexander replied, looking at his reflection. He thinks he is about to charm a faceless board of gullible investors who have never met him and do not know his history. He thinks his practiced, frat boy arrogance is going to save him from the massive lawsuit his early investors are currently preparing. He believes his own hype, Clara. He is walking into this entirely blind, expecting to walk out with a $20 million check. I kissed his cheek, feeling a sudden, intense surge of adrenaline mixed with a profound sense of long-awaited justice. Give him exactly what he deserves, Alexander. Nothing more and absolutely nothing less. Hold up the mirror. Alexander nodded once, grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, and headed out to his waiting black car. What happened over the next 3 hours is something I know down to the most granular, microscopic detail, because Marcus, Alexander's brilliant, ruthless senior partner, recounted the entire event to me later that evening over a glass of 20-year-old scotch. Marcus has a photographic memory for corporate arrogance and human stupidity, and he painted a picture of Julian's ultimate downfall that was so incredibly vivid. I felt like I was sitting right there in the room, watching the execution happen in real time. At exactly 9:45 in the morning, my brother Julian strutted through the massive, revolving glass doors of the Horizon Ventures headquarters in Lower Manhattan. The building itself is a towering, intimidating monument to financial power. It is a sleek, imposing skyscraper of dark steel and tinted glass that positively screams institutional wealth and absolute authority. Julian, CEO and founder, he announced loudly to the head receptionist, making sure his voice carried so the other people waiting in the lobby could hear his incredibly important title. I am here for the 10 o'clock Series B funding pitch with your executive board. Let them know I have arrived, and tell them I am on a tight schedule today. The receptionist, who was fully briefed on the situation and possessed the kind of stoic, icy professionalism that Horizon demanded from all its employees, did not even blink. She simply handed him his temporary badge, pointed a manicured finger toward the back of the lobby, and directed him to the private, high-speed executive elevator. Julian rode the elevator up to the 40th floor. When the doors silently slid open, he stepped out into a sprawling, immaculate reception area that overlooked the breathtaking Manhattan skyline. The floors were polished black marble, the walls were lined with expensive abstract art, and the air smelled faintly of cedar, expensive cologne, and serious money. Marcus was waiting for him near the reception desk. Marcus is a towering, deeply intimidating man in his late 50s who has absolutely zero tolerance for fools or con artists. He greeted Julian with a firm, deliberately bone-crushing handshake and led him down the long, silent, glass-walled corridor toward the main boardroom. "We have been reviewing your preliminary numbers all morning, Julian," Marcus said smoothly as they walked, his tone perfectly neutral but laced with a subtle, dangerous edge. "It seems your tech startup has been burning through its initial capital at a rather astonishing, frankly alarming rate over the past 18 months. We are very eager to hear exactly how you plan to mitigate this incoming disaster." Julian laughed, a forced, high-pitched, nervous sound that echoed uncomfortably off the glass walls. "Oh, you know how it is in the tech sector, Marcus. You have to spend big to win big. User acquisition cost is just a temporary, minor hurdle. It takes money to make money. Once we secure this next round of funding from your firm, our proprietary algorithms are going to completely disrupt the entire market. I guarantee it. You guys are going to see a 10x return on your investment within 2 years." Marcus did not smile. He did not agree. He simply pushed open the incredibly heavy, soundproof mahogany doors to the main boardroom. "We will see about that. You have 10 minutes to set up your presentation. The senior partners will join you shortly to hear your pitch. The CEO will arrive last. Julian confidently strutted into the room. It was a spectacular, deeply intimidating space designed to make visitors feel small. A massive, 20-foot mahogany conference table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by plush, ergonomic black leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the bustling city below. Julian walked directly to the head of the table, opened his sleek, top-of-the-line laptop, and began connecting it to the advanced projection system. He was entirely alone in that massive room for exactly 5 minutes. According to the security cameras that Marcus reviewed later, Julian spent those 5 minutes practically preening like a peacock. He practiced his posture, checking his hair and his smile in the reflection of the tinted windows. He quietly rehearsed his buzzword-heavy, entirely hollow opening lines. He was the absolute picture of a man who fully believed his own ridiculous lies. He believed that his superficial charm, the exact same charm that had successfully manipulated our parents into funding his lavish lifestyle for 30 years, was going to magically save him from complete financial ruin and federal court. He believed he was invincible. At exactly 9:55, the heavy boardroom doors opened again, and 4 senior partners filed into the room in absolute silence. They were dressed in impeccable suits, their faces grim and serious. They took their designated seats quietly, opening their thick, leather-bound dossiers and uncapping their expensive fountain pens. They did not engage in small talk. They did not offer Julian a bottle of water or a cup of coffee. They simply sat back and stared at him with cold, clinical, predatory precision. Julian, ever the raging narcissist who could not handle silence, immediately tried to break the ice and establish dominance. "Quite the spectacular view you guys have up here," he said, leaning casually against the edge of the mahogany table and crossing his arms in an overly familiar, relaxed pose. "Must cost an absolute fortune to lease this floor in this zip code. Hopefully, after today, my company will be generating enough revenue that I can buy the floor right above you." Nobody laughed. Not a single chuckle. The silence in the room was absolute, incredibly heavy, and completely suffocating. The 4 partners just continued to stare at him, their faces entirely blank, their pens poised over their notepads. Julian cleared his throat, his fake, manufactured confidence faltering slightly under their collective, deeply intimidating gaze. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. So he stammered, pulling nervously at the collar of his expensive silk tie. "Are we waiting for anyone else, or should I begin the pitch now?" Marcus mentioned the CEO would be joining us. Marcus looked up from his thick file, his expression utterly unreadable, like a judge preparing to deliver a guilty verdict. "Our CEO is extremely punctual, Julian. He operates on a very strict schedule. He will be here at exactly 10 o'clock. And I highly suggest you save your presentation until he is seated. He is the sole, absolute decision-maker for investments of this magnitude. Without his direct approval, you do not get a single dime." Julian nodded eagerly, pulling his suit jacket tighter around his frame, suddenly looking very small in the massive room. He wanted this money desperately. He needed it to save his sprawling suburban mansion. He needed it to stop his demanding, furious wife, Victoria, from filing for a highly publicized, incredibly messy divorce that would ruin his social standing. He needed it to pay off the furious early investors who were currently drafting a massive, career-ending lawsuit against him for severe financial negligence and fraud. Horizon Ventures was his absolute last hope. Every other major firm on the entire East Coast had already rejected his pitch, seeing right through his inflated, fake numbers and his glaring lack of an actual, functioning product. He stared at the heavy mahogany doors, practically holding his breath, waiting for the mysterious, legendary billionaire CEO to walk through. He was preparing to deploy every single ounce of his manipulative, slick charm. He was ready to grovel, to lie through his teeth, and to promise the moon just to get that check. The digital clock on the sleek wall silently ticked to 10 a.m. The heavy oak doors clicked open. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. The heavy, soundproof mahogany doors swung wide open, moving with a silent, heavy grace, and my husband, Alexander, stepped into the executive boardroom. He was not wearing the plain, unbranded cotton sweaters or the simple khaki pants he wore to my parents' house for those excruciating Thanksgiving dinners. He was wearing the absolute armor of a billionaire corporate titan. He exuded an aura of absolute, terrifying, unyielding authority. He did not look at Julian immediately. He didn't even acknowledge him. He walked slowly, deliberately, with the measured pace of a man who owns the building, toward the massive leather chair at the absolute head of the table, flanked by his silent, fiercely loyal partners. Julian was standing near the glowing projection screen, his clicker ready in his hand. The moment his eyes landed on Alexander, a wave of profound, utter, world-shattering confusion washed over his face. He blinked rapidly 3 or 4 times, his brain completely and totally failing to process the visual information standing right in front of him. He recognized the face, obviously. It was his sister's husband. But the context, the suit, the posture, the way the senior partners deferred to his presence, it was also entirely wrong that Julian's mind simply short-circuited. Julian actually let out a short, condescending, nervous bark of laughter. He took a step forward, a familiar, arrogant smirk forming on his face as he tried to reestablish the family dynamic he was used to. "Alexander," Julian said loudly, his voice dripping with immediate, instinctual superiority. "What in the absolute world are you doing up here on the executive floor? Did Clara finally get tired of you sitting around and make you get a second job? Are you delivering coffee and bagels for the executives now? Seriously, you really shouldn't be in here, man. I have a highly confidential Series B funding pitch with the actual CEO in about 10 seconds, and if they catch a junior admin guy wandering around the boardroom during a multi-million-dollar meeting, they are going to fire you on the spot." Alexander did not stop walking. He did not react to the insult. He reached the head of the table, unbuttoned his suit jacket with one fluid, elegant motion, and sat down in the massive leather chair. He placed his hands flat on the polished mahogany, looking out over the city skyline for a brief second. The 4 senior partners did not flinch. They did not correct Julian. They simply waited in absolute, terrifying silence. Julian's arrogant smirk began to falter. The confusion morphed into a sudden, deep-seated, creeping anxiety. He looked at Marcus, who was sitting directly to Alexander's right, his hands folded neatly over his dossier. "Marcus, I am so sorry about this," Julian stammered, his voice losing its confident edge, trying desperately to maintain his professional facade. "This is my sister's new husband. He's just a mid-level administrative worker. I honestly do not know how he got past security onto the executive floor, but I assure you, he is not with me. You can call security to have him removed." Marcus slowly, deliberately closed his dossier. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers, and looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated, freezing pity. "Julian," Marcus said, his deep voice echoing loudly in the vast, silent room. "Allow me to formally introduce you to the founder, the principal managing partner, and the chief executive officer of Horizon Ventures, Alexander." The color drained from Julian's face with such terrifying, instantaneous speed that Marcus later told me he genuinely thought my brother was experiencing a sudden, massive cardiac event right there on the carpet. The arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by a mask of sheer horror. His jaw literally dropped open, hanging slack. His eyes darted wildly, frantically between Alexander, Marcus, and the other partners, desperately searching for the punchline of a cruel joke that simply did not exist. "No," Julian whispered, the word barely escaping his tight throat. "No, that is impossible. You file paperwork. You pull a mediocre salary. My mother said you were a nobody. You drive a Honda." Alexander finally turned his head and looked directly at Julian. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of mercy. He did not raise his voice. He did not gloat. He did not bring up the empty chairs at our wedding, or the luxury cruise my parents took, or the decades of emotional abuse and financial manipulation my family had inflicted upon me. He did not need to. True, absolute power does not need to shout. "Sit down, Julian," Alexander commanded softly. It was not a polite request. It was an absolute, unbreakable directive from a king sitting on his throne. Julian's legs physically gave out. He stumbled backward and practically collapsed into the nearest leather chair, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the armrests to steady himself. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped onto a hidden landmine in a war zone and had just heard the metal click under his boot. "Let us begin the evaluation," Alexander said, casually opening the thick, highly detailed financial file in front of him. "I have spent the entire weekend thoroughly reviewing the financial disclosures, the tax returns, and the user data for your tech startup. I must admit, Julian, in my 15 years of venture capital investment, I have rarely, if ever, seen a more catastrophic, embarrassing display of gross financial mismanagement, staggering operational incompetence, and borderline fraudulent user acquisition metrics." Julian tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but only a pathetic, choked gasp came out of his mouth. Alexander continued, his voice methodically, ruthlessly slicing through Julian's massive ego like a surgical titanium scalpel. "You are sitting here asking Horizon Ventures for a $20 million Series B cash injection. You claim this money will be used to finalize your supposedly revolutionary, proprietary algorithm. However, according to your own internal audits, which my legal team has thoroughly subpoenaed during our strict due diligence phase, you do not actually have a working algorithm. You have nothing. Your core technology is entirely outsourced to a..." Alexander flipped a page in the dossier, the sound sharp and crisp in the silent room. "Furthermore, my legal department is fully aware of the impending, massive lawsuit from your Series A investors regarding your blatant breach of fiduciary duty. You are not here to build a company, Julian. You are here to find a rich idiot to provide a bailout for your own gross negligence so you can avoid personal bankruptcy and potential criminal liability for wire fraud." Julian was fully hyperventilating now. He was gripping his chest. The stark, undeniable reality of his situation was crashing down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. The quiet man he had relentlessly mocked, the man his entire family had treated like an uneducated peasant, was holding the entire trajectory of his life, his freedom, and his marriage in his hands, and was currently crushing it to absolute dust. "Alexander, look, man, we are family," Julian suddenly blurted out, abandoning all pretense of a professional corporate pitch. He leaned desperately across the heavy mahogany table, his hands clasped together in a pathetic, begging gesture. "You are married to Clara. We are brothers-in-law. You know how my parents are, they just push me too hard to succeed, they put too much pressure on me. If you don't approve this funding, I lose the house. Victoria will file for divorce, she already hired a ruthless lawyer. My twins are coming next month. You cannot do this to your own family. I will give you 60% equity. I will step down as CEO right now. Just write the check, Alexander. Please. I am begging you on my hands and knees." Alexander stared at him for a long, incredibly heavy moment. He looked at the man who had stolen every ounce of affection, time, and resources from his wife. He looked at the man whose inflated, unchecked ego had caused my parents to abandon me on my wedding day to go on a cruise. Alexander slowly, deliberately closed the dossier. He placed his hands flat on the table and leaned slightly forward, his eyes boring holes into Julian's soul. "Horizon Ventures is a strict meritocracy," Julian Alexander said, his tone chillingly polite and entirely final. "We invest in brilliant minds, robust, scalable technology, and leaders with unwavering, proven integrity. You possess absolutely none of these qualities. Your business model is a pathetic house of cards, and your personal character is fundamentally bankrupt. We will not be investing a single dollar of our capital into your doomed, fraudulent enterprise." Alexander stood up, casually buttoning his suit jacket. "The evaluation is over. Marcus will have security escort you out of the building. I strongly suggest you contact a good bankruptcy lawyer immediately. You are going to need one. Julian tried to lunge forward, sobbing hysterically, screaming Alexander's name, begging for a second chance, but two massive, stone-faced security guards were already entering the room from the side door. They grabbed Julian by the arms, hauled him roughly to his feet, and forcefully escorted him out of the boardroom. He was dragged down the polished marble hallway, past the reception desk where he had acted so arrogant just 30 minutes prior, and shoved into the elevator, entirely humiliated, completely broken, and utterly destroyed. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below, so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover the story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Within exactly 2 hours of Julian being unceremoniously thrown out onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk by Horizon Ventures security team, my cell phone, which had remained blissfully silent from my family's end for over a month, began to violently detonate. I was sitting on the back porch of our sprawling estate with my cup of chamomile tea, a light breeze rustling the leaves, watching the afternoon sun filter through the ancient oak trees. The digital notifications were coming in so incredibly fast the phone was actually vibrating itself across the glass patio table. I just sat there and watched the little red numbers climb. 50 missed calls. 100 missed calls. 200. The text messages popping up on the preview screen were a chaotic, hysterical, entirely unhinged blend of deep confusion, absolute panic, and sheer, unfiltered terror. Julian had obviously called our parents the exact moment his expensive leather shoes hit the pavement outside the building. The luxury Caribbean cruise was long over, and my parents were back in their sprawling, heavily mortgaged suburban New Jersey home, completely and totally unprepared for the financial apocalypse that was about to hit them like a freight train. I finally reached out and picked up the phone. I bypassed Julian's 60 frantic voicemails. I had absolutely no desire to hear a grown man whine about the consequences of his own actions, and scrolled down to my mother's contact name. I tapped her most recent voicemail, leaned back in my chair, and held the phone to my ear. Margaret's voice, usually so perfectly composed, so incredibly arrogant, and dripping with practiced, country club condescension, was a shrill, hysterical, utterly broken mess. She was sobbing uncontrollably, gasping for air, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate, pathetic attempt to manipulate a reality she could no longer control. Clara, pick up the damn phone right now, she screamed into the recording, her voice cracking. Julian just called us. He is hyperventilating in a coffee shop. What did you do, Clara? Why didn't you tell us Alexander was a billionaire? Why did you hide this from your own flesh and blood? We would have treated him differently. We would have welcomed him. You set us up to fail. Julian's investors are seizing his corporate accounts right now. Victoria is packing her bags. She took the kids' trust funds and is taking the cars. He is going to lose everything, Clara. You have to fix this. Call Alexander right now and tell him to reverse his decision. You are his wife. You have to save your brother. I deleted the voicemail with a single tap. My phone immediately rang again. It was my mother. I decided I had allowed them to suffer in the unknown dark long enough. I calmly swiped the green button and answered the call. Clara, my mother shrieked the exact moment the digital line connected. Oh, thank God. Listen to me right now. You have to drive to Alexander's office. There has been a terrible, horrible misunderstanding. Julian is family. We are family. We love Alexander, we always have. We just didn't know how to show it because he was so quiet. You cannot let your husband destroy your brother's life over a stupid business deal. I did not say a word. I let her speak. I let her exhaust herself against the cold, impenetrable wall of my silence. I listened to her hyperventilate, listened to my father in the background yelling frantically about having to liquidate his retirement fund to bail Julian out of the impending federal lawsuit. I listened to the sound of their carefully constructed, arrogant world completely collapsing in on itself. I took a slow, deep sip of my tea, savoring the absolute, perfect stillness of the air around me. When she finally ran out of breath and was just reduced to pathetic, wet sobbing into the receiver, I spoke. My voice was so profoundly calm, so entirely detached from any familial emotion, that it sounded like a stranger to my own ears. My family, I said slowly, emphasizing the word so it hung heavily and lethally in the digital space between us, consists of my husband, Alexander, and the people who actually showed up to celebrate our union. You made it abundantly clear, Margaret, that a 2-hour drive down a paved interstate was simply too exhausting a journey for you to support me on my wedding day. Clara, please, that was different. We were tired from California. We didn't mean it, she tried to interrupt, crying hysterically, begging for a lifeline. I cut her off, my voice turning to absolute, razor-sharp ice. So I am absolutely certain you will understand my current position. Walking all the way from the kitchen to my husband's home office to ask him to compromise his billion-dollar firm, his professional integrity, and his investors' money for a man who couldn't even bother to RSVP to our wedding is simply too taxing on my energy. I am just entirely drained, Mom. I simply cannot make the trip. Clara, if you don't help us, we will have to empty our retirement accounts to save his house. We will lose our real estate portfolio. You are destroying us, she wailed, the manipulation turning into desperate anger. A bankruptcy is just a financial party, I replied, throwing her exact, cruel words from 2 months ago directly back into her face. You shouldn't be so selfish as to demand I put my husband's corporate health at risk for a bailout. I will send a nice sympathy card in the mail. Have a nice life, Margaret. I hung up the phone. I didn't just hang up. I went deep into my phone's settings and systematically, methodically blocked her number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Julian's number. I blocked Victoria, Fiona, Sarah, and every single toxic aunt, uncle, and cousin who had blindly followed my mother's lead and abandoned me. I severed every single digital, social, and emotional tie connecting me to the people who had raised me, finalizing the permanent boundary that they themselves had initiated when they chose a luxury cruise over my wedding day. The fallout over the next few incredibly dramatic months was total, absolute, and entirely irreversible. The dominoes fell exactly as Alexander and his legal team had predicted. Without the massive Series B funding injection from Horizon, Julian's startup officially collapsed and filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The furious early investors filed a massive, multi-million-dollar lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, dragging Julian through a highly publicized, deeply humiliating legal battle that made the front page of several business blogs. Victoria, realizing the endless money was gone and her precious social prestige was permanently shattered, filed for a vicious divorce. She demanded full custody of the newborn twins, along with alimony payments Julian simply could not afford. To keep Julian out of federal prison for wire fraud and to pay off his massive, mounting legal fees, my parents were forced to drastically dip into their beloved, heavily guarded retirement savings. They had to sell their vacation home in the Hamptons. They had to liquidate their entire real estate portfolio at a massive loss. They had to drain the very funds they had hoarded and bragged about my entire life. Their days of extravagant cross-country flights, $75,000 gender reveals, and performative, arrogant country club wealth were permanently, entirely over. They were reduced to living on a strict, depressing budget, trapped in a downsizing. It has been 3 years since that fateful, explosive day in the Manhattan boardroom. The dust from the collapse of my family's empire has completely settled, and the entire landscape of my life looks entirely, beautifully different. Alexander and I are still living in our beautiful, tranquil estate in the mountains. We recently welcomed our first child, a beautiful little girl, into the world. Her nursery is painted a soft yellow, and it is filled with sunlight, warmth, and the absolute, unbreakable certainty that she will never, ever have to compete for her parents' love. She will never be the glass child. We have built a vibrant, loving life surrounded by our chosen family, People like Silas, Marcus, and the fiercely loyal friends who stood by us when the seats on my side of the aisle were glaringly empty. My biological family has tried to reach out a handful of times over the past 3 years, always using sneaky, manipulative back channels. My cousin Fiona actually drove all the way to our gated community about a year ago, trying to sweet-talk her way past the security pavilion. She brought a thick stack of envelopes, supposed apology letters, from my parents and Julian. Security, following my strict orders, turned her away at the gate, but she managed to mail the letters to Alexander's corporate office in the city. Alexander brought them home that evening, and we read them together sitting by the fireplace in our living room. They were exactly what I expected them to be. They were not apologies. They were heavily disguised, pathetic requests for money and favors. My mother wrote a long, rambling letter about how much she missed my face, followed immediately by a dense paragraph explaining exactly how expensive Julian's ongoing custody battle had become. She actually had the audacity to ask if Alexander could set up $1 million college trust fund for Julian's twins to ease the financial burden on the family. My father wrote a short, pathetic letter asking if Alexander could quietly hire Julian for an entry-level consulting position at Horizon, just to get him back on his feet and out of their basement. There was no genuine remorse in those pages. There was no accountability for the decades of neglect. There was only the desperate, clawing, selfish need of people who had realized far too late that they had thrown away their winning lottery ticket. I tossed the letters directly into the fireplace and watched the expensive stationery curl, blacken, and turn to ash. As I watched them burn, I realized I felt absolutely nothing. No lingering guilt. No burning anger. No sadness. Just a profound, enduring, beautiful relief. I have spent these subsequent years reflecting deeply on my journey, thinking about what I would tell anyone watching this who finds themselves perpetually positioned as the afterthought in their own family. To the child expected to absorb endless disrespect while continuously offering unquestioning loyalty. To the daughter who is told her quiet achievements do not matter while her brother's massive failures are endlessly celebrated and bailed out. Listen to me very carefully. Blood does not mandate submission. Sharing a last name with someone does not require you to permanently anchor yourself to a sinking ship. You do not have to tie yourself to people who view your existence as a mild inconvenience until the exact moment it becomes a financial asset for them. When people show you that their love is conditional, transactional, and entirely dependent on what you can do to elevate their public image, you must believe them the very first time. You must give yourself the profound, liberating permission to stop aggressively auditioning for a role they never, ever intended to cast you in. You do not owe your hard-earned success to the people who ignored you in the dark. And you absolutely, unequivocally do not owe them a seat at the table once you have built your own castle in the light. Your greatest revenge against a narcissistic family is not screaming matches in the living room. It is not aggressive, tear-filled confrontations or petty, passive-aggressive arguments on social media. Your greatest, most devastating revenge is absolute, unbothered, untouchable peace. It is a peace achieved by quietly stepping out of their toxic, chaotic narrative, setting impenetrable legal and emotional boundaries, and allowing the natural, inevitable consequences of their own arrogance to completely and utterly dismantle them. While my family stews in the bitter, cold reality of their own making, endlessly arguing over depleted bank accounts, pawned jewelry, and shattered, fragile egos, I sit quietly on my porch. I drink my tea. I watch the sun set over the private lake with my brilliant, loving husband and my beautiful, perfect daughter. I am living a spectacular life they will never, ever be a part of. And it is entirely glorious. Thank you for experiencing this incredibly personal journey with me today. If you believe that respect should always be earned, regardless of bloodlines, and that walking away from toxic family members is a sign of immense strength, please subscribe to the channel. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to cut off the people who were supposed to love you the most because they only love themselves? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Remember, your peace is your absolute power. Do not let anyone take it from you. See you in the next video.